Up about that. So this is intimate partner violence in the workplace, building safer spaces. I am Samantha Strader. I work for the Delta program at the Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. And what that means, my job is to work to educate and train people and talk to people and oversee programs that are all focused on prevention work. So we're all working on preventing violence from ever happening in the first place. It's a lot of different programs that I oversee and a lot of exciting work. Today, we're specifically going to be talking about safer workplaces. I'm going to talk about how to identify the warning signs of intimate partner violence, help you gain insight into how those impact the workplace, help you learn about policy recommendations, different kinds of policy recommendations, and also how to just build safer workplaces while responding to intimate partner violence that may be outside of just policies. So this is the power and control wheel. And I wanted to talk about this really so that you have a good understanding of what domestic violence looks like. So what this is the idea that while we tend to think about domestic violence as just being the physical violence, it is so much more than that. Really what it is an attempt to have total power and control over the partner. And the abusive partner will do many things in order to kind of coerce that kind of control over the other person. And physical violence or the threat of physical violence is just kind of the cage that holds that relationship together. But it's really the idea of power and control that's at the center of it. And there are many ways that an abuser will try to do that, from coercion and threats to emotional abuse, name calling. Isolating from family and friends is a really, really big one. Denying, minimizing, and blaming. It's never their fault. It's always the other person's fault. So they sell things like, if you didn't make me so mad, I wouldn't have punched that wall. Or if you didn't do X, I wouldn't have harmed you in this way, right? So it's always the victim's fault for the abuser's behavior. Using children, using any kind of privilege. So that could even be like immigrant status privilege, right? Like if the victim is an immigrant and maybe doesn't have full legal status, then the abuser could say like, I'll turn you in, I'll get you deported. If it's a queer relationship and maybe one of the people is not out, the other person could say, I'll out you to your workplace, which in some places is, not protected. So you could be fired for that. So there's all kinds of ways to use privilege. And then I wanted to pay specific attention also to this idea of economic abuse, because that's really the one that impacts workplaces the most. So this is where an abuser will prevent the victim from getting a job or keeping a job, or might show up and harass at the workplace. And we're going to talk about that a lot more and about how that can look in the workplace. But first, I wanted everybody to have really a good understanding of what domestic violence looks like and how these relationships function and cycle and play out. And I could talk about this much more, but just wanted to give you a basic understanding of these relationships. So why should workplaces care? There's a lot of reasons, but to make it really blunt, it's kind of a bottom line issue, right? Intimate partner or domestic violence, I'll use those interchangeably, often spill over into the workplace where victims can be hurt, harassed, harmed, abused by the abuser. The workplace may be the one place where the abuser knows how to find the partner if the partner has left the relationship, or if they're just trying to figure out where the person is. They will come to the workplace because that's often where they know they can be found. The CDC estimates that domestic violence costs the US at least $8 billion a year in lost productivity and healthcare costs. So we're talking like a big financial cost to this, and that impacts businesses. More than 44% of US adults say they have experienced the effects of domestic violence in the workplace. So that's quite a lot of people. So that's all of this to say that workplaces have a role in addressing this, in understanding this, and figuring out how it's impacting their workplace and how to better protect their workers in this situation. We tend to think, or some people tend to think that it's like, that's a home issue. Why do I need to worry about it? But there's lots of reasons why people might need to worry about it. I just saw a question come up that, will you have access to the slides? Yeah, my email address will be at the end. So if you would like to email me for the slides, that's fine. I will be happy to share them. So this is more stats about why workplaces should care, just a little bit more information about that. 32% of victims say that they were threatened enough to make them leave work. And 35% had an abusive partner harass them at work. 27% had their cars sabotaged so they couldn't get to work. 32% were threatened that if they tried to go to work, what would happen if they went to work. Sometimes that can be threatening pets or animals or kids or them directly. And not only does this negatively impact victims, but also abusers are less able to work and focus and function while at work, and often use workplace supplies, cars, phones, in order to perpetuate harm against somebody else. So the abuser stats are 57% of men in the study reported that they were unable to concentrate at work because of feelings or thoughts about their partner. And 54% of abusers actually went to the partner's workplace to harass them. So what we're seeing is that this is not just a problem for victims in the workplace, but it's also a problem for abusers in the workplace. We'll kind of talk about response to both of those situations. So how domestic violence can look in the workplace. So this can be tricky sometimes to see it in the workplace, because oftentimes people will be pretty secretive and not really want to talk about it, understandably. So victims, things to look out for is that victims might be frequently late or exhibit high signs of stress, have excessive, pretty much unexplained absences, difficulty concentrating at work, or any kind of signs in decrease or change in work productivity. So these can be caused by a lot of different things, but it can be a clue to you as a supervisor or a leader in your organization that something might be wrong. So just keep an eye out for some of these things, and we'll talk about kind of how to respond, but these are some of the less obvious things. Of course, some of the obvious ones might be, physical signs like bruising, things like that. Abusers can impact a victim's ability to find a job, have a job, or even do the job while they're there. So abusers can do things like taking car keys or bus passes or preventing transportation to work. We saw this in the stats of how many people reported that their abuser had sabotaged their vehicle in some way. So that's common. Hiding necessary work items like key cards, uniforms, those kind of things. Threaten or physically prevent the victim from leaving for work. So, blocking the door or locking people in rooms, things like that. Threatening, I kind of mentioned this earlier, threatening to neglect children or pets while the victim is at work. Saying things like, if you leave, who's going to feed the kids? Like, you're here, you could do that. But they're going to make the victim feel guilty for leaving and going to work. Call multiple times a day or come to the workplace multiple times a day to check on the victim. I wanted to pause right here because this is the one that I feel like most often negatively impacts the victim. There are so many stories that I've heard where the victim is then fired from their job after the abuser has come to harass on the workplace. And so that's really problematic and troublesome. And if you take nothing away from this presentation, except we don't want victims punished for abuser behavior. We don't need victims being fired, losing that financial stability, losing any kind of financial resources that makes them more dependent upon the abuser. So this is like the thing that cannot happen, is we can't have victims being punished for abuser behavior. But that's often what happens, unfortunately. Abuser behavior interferes with their own ability to find a job or keep a job or do their job. Abusers report not being able to concentrate or perform because of thoughts about their partner. They use workplace resources, so think workplace vehicles, workplace phones, to stalk and harass their victims. If the victim and the abuser work in the same place, it creates even greater potential for harassment and harm to happen. So just be aware of that, that abusers are harmful in the workplace as well, not just in the victim's workplace, but in their own workplace. So I want to pause for a minute and ask if there are any questions or comments about kind of what we've talked about so far, because we're about to transition into kind of how to respond to these issues in the workplace. I'm seeing that someone noticed that they could see a distinct lack of self-confidence. Yeah, totally. When you're in an abusive relationship, the abuser is constantly telling you that you're not good enough, or that no one believes in you or wants you or likes you, so they're like tearing you down a lot. So that kind of like not having a lot of confidence is common. Could also go the other way, where somebody becomes really hard and closed off and, almost like a tough shell exterior. So it can kind of go both ways there of how people will respond to that, but that's a good point. If there are no questions, I'm just going to keep rolling. So how employers can help? There is a lot of different ways. Some key things to remember, this is just to kind of start us off on the conversation of how to stop intimate partner violence in the workplace. Some key things to remember are that victims are already experiencing this lack of power and control in their lives, which is what we've been talking about. All the different ways that the abuser is trying to prevent victims from having any choice or say or power. So they're already experiencing that. So it's important for us to remember that as leaders, as supervisors, as coworkers, what we can do is try to empower them, give them some of that power back. And not everyone wants or needs the same kind of help, right? So, just because you would do something one way doesn't mean that that victim should do that. Maybe it's not safe for them to do the way you would do, or maybe they don't have as many supports, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But so just remembering that the best thing that we can do is say, I'm here with you and I support whatever decision you make, and whatever, that helps them feel like they have a sense of control. Keeping any information that you gain confidential is key. That's so important, that we are respecting their privacy and their autonomy, and that we're not going and telling people who do not need to know about the situation. You can show concern and care, but do not push for more information than they're willing to share, or for certain outcomes. Again, like just because you want them to call the police or get an order of protection or whatever the thing is that you think should happen, does not mean that that's necessarily what's best for them. So things that you can always say, that's always okay to say, is abuse is never your fault, and it's not. Abuse is the cause of the abuser's actions, not the fault of the victim. You can always say you are not alone. This is a common issue, as we see from the stats earlier in the presentation. Many people are experiencing this, so you're not alone. And there is help available. There are resources. And one of the things that you as a workplace can do is know what those resources are for your area. Know your local domestic violence shelter, know the hotline numbers. And I'm going to provide some of those resources a little bit later, but know what those resources are so that you can just give them, so that they know when they're ready, they can call and ask for help. I wanted to debunk a little bit of a myth at this point, the why don't they just leave? This is a really common question, but frankly, it's misguided. Victims can have many reasons for staying. They can be afraid of what the abuser will do if they leave, because the fact is, the most dangerous time for a victim is as they are leaving or right after they leave, because the abuser senses that loss of control, and the victim is much more likely to be harmed or killed in those moments. So their fear of leaving is completely justified. You never really want to push someone to leave unless they are choosing to and have a really, really strong safety plan in place. So just bear that in mind. They may be completely isolated from family and friends and other support systems. If you remember from the power and control wheel, isolation is a key piece of abuse. They're going to not let you see friends and family. They're going to pull you away from any kind of support system you might have, including your financial support system, right? That's why they don't want you to have a job or get a job or have your own money, because that's something that's independent from their control. So they could be really isolated and have no other support system. They may be reliant on that partner for childcare or housing or financial support in some way. And again, be really isolated from other kinds of supports. So they may feel like they need that support system. And I can't undervalue the power of the love that people have for their harmful partners. They love this person. They just don't want that person to be abusive. I often hear things like, I love him, I just wish he wasn't abusive, right? Like, so it's really hard for people to walk away from someone that they love, that they hope will change and become safer and better. Question also, like, just to bear in mind that this is just a way of thinking that is victim blaming. We are, by the nature of this question, putting blame on the victim instead of on the abuser and holding the abuser accountable for the abuser's behavior, right? We're still making victims accountable for their situation and for their outcome in a way that is unfair, because they are not the perpetrator of the abuse. The abuser is the perpetrator of the abuse, and we need to hold the abuser accountable. So avoid this question. Avoid statements like you should, anything that starts with you should just leave, you should call the police. This is disempowering. This is telling the victim what to do. It's not giving them agency or power in the situation. And it often will shut a victim down completely. Like, they're just going to shut down. As anyone would when we feel like we're not being heard or supported or understood. And then it's just more of the same, like, oh, this is just another person trying to control me and trying to tell me what to do. So these are things to avoid. So what I want you to, and you don't have to ask this question, right, to a victim. This is just for your own kind of thought process and thought bubble, is think about the question, why do abusers abuse? And this question keeps the accountability on the abuser for their own behavior. And abusers abuse for any number of reasons. This is not an exhaustive list, but the first one I think of is because it works, right? Like, if their goal is to maintain total control, cage around this person, then their tactics work to do so. Like, it's successful in doing that. These tactics are so effective that it really does create this unbreakable prison for so many people. So it gets them what they want. It gets them the power and control that they want. There are little to no consequences. Our culture and society and legal systems do a really bad job of holding abusers accountable. I just took a call from a woman the other day who, after, calling the police, they were only able to hold him for 12 hours. That doesn't do her much good. Like, she can't find a new place to live or go somewhere in those 12 hours that he's in prison. So, and often calling the police will make it worse because of just that, right? Like, they hold the abuser for the 12 hours, the abuser comes back to the home. Now they're even more mad. Now they're like, you did this, you called the police, this is your fault, you did this to me. So the abuse becomes worse. So we just don't have a good system for protecting victims, and our legal system does a really bad job of it. I think I'm preaching to the choir to most of our advocates that it's just not a system that's set up to protect victims. Abuse could be a learned behavior. They've witnessed this similar pattern as children. Something to always remember is that abuse is a choice. Abusers know how to behave differently, and we know that because they, can put on this good act in front of people that they don't want to know that they're abusive, right? So this is why we often hear disbelief from friends and family of, no, they would never do this. They're not that kind of person. When in reality, behind closed doors, they are. So we know that it's a choice of behavior because they can choose different behaviors in different situations. It's not just like how they are or whatever. It's a very deliberate choice. Abuse is not caused by, and this is often what gets blamed, it is not caused by alcohol, drugs, or other substances. Those things can make the abuse worse, right? They can, if you're already an abusive person and you become intoxicated, then the abuse is going to escalate. So it can escalate abuse, but it's not going to cause abusive situations. It's not caused by anger, which is why anger management classes are not appropriate. And they're actually contraindicated. When we put an abuser in anger management classes, it often does not work and it can make the abuse actually worse. So it's not an anger problem. It's not caused by stress, although again, stress can exacerbate, can make it worse, right? If you're already kind of an abusive situation and then you add a lot of stress on top of that, the abuse is going to escalate. And it's not caused by the victim's behavior, although this is what the abuser will often claim. Again, like I was saying, like if you didn't do X, then I wouldn't punch walls or hit you or whatever. So it's often blamed on the victim behavior, and the victim can really start to believe that, can start to say, well, maybe if I could change this or do this differently, then, you know, the relationship would change and I could fix it. So the victim starts to believe that and starts to believe that they might deserve the abuse. But it is not caused by the victim's behavior. We are all adults who are responsible for our own choices and behavior, and that includes abusers. So how can workplaces make a difference? Workplaces can take steps to promote safer spaces, and this is done again in a lot of different ways. One of the most important actions that any workplace can do is to make a zero tolerance policy for violence in the workplace. And we're going to talk a lot more in depth about that, what that policy can look like specific to Tennessee, because there are lots of different policies for different states depending on the laws in the state. And I'm going to give you resources for different kinds of policies, but we're going to talk specifically about kind of a model policy for Tennessee. We also can consider creating procedural recommendations. So outside of having just your policy, because it's pretty basic, just having a zero tolerance policy is pretty basic. Having some procedural recommendations and some safety planning guidelines in place can be super duper helpful. Again, I cannot stress enough how important it is to remember that you have to keep all this information confidential. This is a great one. Consider posting local domestic violence resources in common areas like break rooms or bathrooms. So we offer a toolkit that in the toolkit is a one page that you can print out and put in your workplaces in these common areas that have just some basic quick warning signs. Am I in an abusive relationship? What to do, and then resources for hotlines and safety planning. So it's a good just little resource that, you know, people don't have to come to you directly for or tell you anything. They can just have that resource available. So I would recommend that. Host trainings for your staff, especially your leadership staff, on warning signs and how to respond to violence. Having a trained workforce is really important and effective. And it could be the whole workforce, right? Like a training like this could be appropriate for your whole workplace. And people can start to learn what the warning signs are for themselves and maybe be thinking for themselves, and the resources are in here. And then specifically, especially for leadership, to know how to respond to these issues in the workplace. A training like this or other trainings like this are super important. So we're going to talk about this zero tolerance, violence-free workplace policy. We got this language directly from OSHA. According to OSHA, the best protection employees can offer is to establish a zero tolerance policy towards workplace violence against or by their employees. And I really like that both of those are in there, right? Like it's violence against or perpetrated by their employees. So if you have that zero tolerance policy in place and you realize that one of your employees is using the company vehicle or the company phone to harass or stalk or harm someone, you have a policy in place to take action against that, right? So I think that that's really important to have. Any policy should include a safe complaint procedure for employees to report their concern about potential or actual threats, intimidation, or violence without fear of reprisal. So we need it to be in place that, again, we're not punishing victims for coming forward. We're not punishing the people who are already being harmed for what they're experiencing. The procedure should protect confidentiality, again, super key, and should identify a designated official to receive these reports. So you have to have somebody on your staff who's designated to receive the reports as they're coming in, whether that's your HR staff or whoever you deem is appropriate. The type of policy you put in place in Tennessee specifically is going to depend on so many different factors. The size of your organization, what resources you have available, your own unique protective and risk factors, and you have to consult with your HR department or your legal counsel to decide what kind of policy might be best for your organization. There are all kinds of policies ranging from legal best practices for the federal level on down to kind of this more basic thing. And the reason why this one we're going with like kind of the most basic recommendation is because in Tennessee, it's a right to work state and workers have very few legal protections. So we can't really recommend that organizations put in the federal best policies because there's no like legal foothold really in Tennessee for those yet. And I stress the yet. We are really working to try to get workers to have more protections in Tennessee. We need that. We need worker rights, in my opinion. But this is a good place to start. So if your organization doesn't have this, it is a really good place to at least start and get a toehold into making a difference in your organization. Then we can talk about procedural considerations and safety planning for the workplace. So safety planning is a process that is different for each individual person who's experiencing violence. And as a leader or a supervisor in your organization, or even a colleague or coworker, if you're a colleague or coworker, I would recommend involving a supervisor. But you should involve the victim in the process of planning, of safety planning. They're going to know their abuser the best. They're going to know their situation the best. They're going to know already what's working for them to keep them safe. So they're going to have all this information. We call them the expert in their own experience. So involving them in the process of safety planning is super key. Really, I can't imagine an effective safety plan that does not include the victim. You have to include the victim in this process. And some examples of considerations that you might make for the workplace are things like, can you minimize initial risk by conducting comprehensive background checks on all new hires for violent offenses? So this is going to protect you from, hopefully in some ways, protect you from hiring the person who's going to be the abuser in the workplace, who's going to use workplace time or phones or cars or whatever to perpetrate violence. Another thing to think about is, does your organization have guidelines for firearms or other weapons on site? Do you have a policy in place about no firearms or no weapons? And if not, you might need to think about doing so. Analyze your organization for risk. Consider areas, parking areas, lobbies, entrances, anywhere where your organization is public facing. Consider those spaces and how they can be made safer. Can access be limited? Are there security cameras? These are kind of things that you can start to think about in making things safer. Can the victim be given parking closer to the entrance? So, or can they have an escort from their parking place or the bus stop? Can we get them into the building safely? And how do we do that in the best way? Can the workstation be moved to a safer or a new location? Can they be relocated so that the abuser may not know where to find them? Is the work schedule adjustable? Can hours be changed? And the important thing to think about with that is any change to work scheduling should not impact income, right? Like we don't want to decrease hours or harm income in any way, because these victims are super reliant on this income, especially as they're trying to leave the abuser. They need the financial stability. So we don't want to do anything that's going to threaten their financial stability. Can calls be screened or limited? and definitely limit the amount of information that's disclosed to people outside the workplace. It's becoming more well known, thank goodness, that we shouldn't be giving our coworkers work schedules to people outside of the business, right? Like if somebody calls and says, when's Ashley going to be in next? Don't tell them that information. That person could be harmful. And that actually happened to me one time where I was working. There was a person who was trying to find me, and I called and given like a fake name and was like, when does Samantha come in next? And the girl was just like, oh yeah, she'll be in, blah, blah, blah. You should come say hi. And I was like, no. So this happens, right? The abusers know how to call and sound really charming and fun and kind and whatever, and get this information from other employees. So make sure that, again, this is where training your employees can be so important, of like, here's why we don't give out this information to people outside the organization. So things like that. Can we think about safety in specific to your organization, specific to your situations, specific to your own risk and protective factors that, some of these could be put in place across the board, and then that could help everyone be safer, not just for specific victims. So I wanted to take a quick note here on orders of protection. So sometimes a victim can obtain an order of protection, and an order of protection, for anyone who does not know, is a document that legally prevents the abuser from contacting the victim in any way. It's kind of like a restraining order, except that it's really specific to domestic violence, and has some extra stipulations, but think of it as basically a restraining order. If a victim has an order of protection, an employer may want to request a copy of that so they can have that and a picture of the abuser with any kind of security or frontline staff, so that everybody's aware this person is not allowed here and is not allowed to be on property, not allowed to be close to the victim in any way, not allowed to call, not allowed to contact, nothing. You need to get like consent from the victim to obtain that information and to give it to the frontline staff. But I think that if you're including them in safety planning and understand that that's what's safest, then we can get victims on board with that. An employer, this is an interesting thing that I did not know until our corporate lawyer told us this. As an organization, an agency, you can obtain an order of protection against an offender if they have come to the property, or if they have made threats against the property or against people inside, like your workers. So you can obtain an order of protection against an abuser, which is wonderful and really cool. What you should be aware of, though, is that you should never try to force a victim to get an order of protection or to make a police report, because again, that may not be what's safest for them or what's in their best interest. So but you can't force a victim to get one. This is just a little visual that I made about kind of responding. This is like a little flow chart about responding. So there's kind of these three different situations, right? And so if an employee discloses intimate partner violence to you, how do you respond? The first thing you want to do is support the victim and assure the employee that the information that they've told you will be confidential, and then discuss safety planning and appropriate work accommodations as you're able to. Is there PTO available that they can use for attending court or any other needs that they have? Can the work schedule be modified, make the victim harder to track? Or can workplace demands be flexible, again, without negatively impacting pay, right? If we know that this person is going through a pretty difficult time, maybe there's a lighter job that they can do for a little while, but still, make the money that they need to make. Assist, providing with resources, is so important. Just to know that there are resources available and to be able to give them to the employee is so important. Creating that safety plan is important. Again, if there's an order of protection, you can obtain a copy of it. Remember that there are also professionals available who can assist with the completion of safety plans at any state, local, national hotlines. There are people who can answer the phone at the hotline. And if you say, I'm an employer and I need to help make a safety plan, a workplace safety plan for this person, they should be able to help you do that. They're trained in making safety plans. So if you don't feel totally confident in that aspect, there are people who can help do that. And then if there is imminent threat, if the abuser is on property with a weapon, making threats, all those things, then it's like appropriate to call the police. Again, try to include the victim in calling the police, but do not make them file a police report. Do not make them get an order of protection or anything like that, as it may not be the safest option for them at that time. But you have the right to call the police if the person is there being a threat, totally. So there's these kind of 3 different responses as you become aware of domestic violence and its impact on the workplace. Try not to skip too many at a time. There we go. I just wanted to take a moment and talk briefly about COVID and its impacts on intimate partner violence, because they've been intense. It's been hard, likely due to an increase in stress and also this increase in isolation. All of us are more isolated. DV incidents have risen. Many DV and IPV supportive services have documented an increase in calls for assistance, also difficulty in meeting the needs of all the calls they're getting for assistance. There's just not enough resources to go around. Oftentimes, it's just become harder for people both to reach out for help and to stay safe in their homes. So just be aware of that. Be aware that, like, we may all be seeing an increase in violence at this time because of the high stress of the situation and the increased isolation of the situation. And if you're working from home, we may see this even more, right? But it also may be more difficult to notice. So I wanted to spend just a brief moment and talk about this as well. It can be especially difficult to pick up on these warning signs if you're in a work from home situation. Warning signs could still be the same things, like change in productivity, frequent absences or lateness, signs of stress. You can also look for things like if the camera or sound is always off during meetings, or if they seem distracted during meetings, or like really obviously if the person is like lingering in the background all the time or watching, or if the person seems fearful. Those are things to watch for. We have to remember that confidentiality is still key here. It's still so important to respect somebody's confidentiality, and with this situation in particular, their safety, because it's going to be really hard for them to ask for help or for you to ask about if they're safe in a way that's safe from the abuser, right? Because if we're doing it out loud, you don't know if the abuser can be listening in the background. If you're doing it over email, you don't know if the abuser could be monitoring emails. So it can be really difficult to figure out how to connect in a safe way. Just trying to ask kind of openly, hey, you seem stressed, are you okay? Is there a safe time to talk about it? Is there a safe way to talk about it? Things like that are kind of open-ended. Maybe let the victim decide when it might be safe to talk about it, and kind of follow their lead on safety for, they know their situation the best. This hand signal I wanted to include because it's been publicized a lot lately. So it's something that people are knowing about and may utilize. So if you see that hand signal, then that's like, obviously someone is in trouble. And you could, start the same kind of processes of, how can I help? What can we do? Here's a hotline number, like however you want to try to give them that information. So we're coming up here close to the end. We're going to have some time for some questions at the end, which I love. So in summary, intimate partner violence really truly is a workplace safety and productivity issue. Abusers impact the victim's ability to work. They impact workplace safety and bottom line cost and productivity. Workplaces can take action by training their staff, especially leadership staff, on how to respond, what the warning signs are, common myths, and debunking those myths. Workplaces should commit to a zero tolerance for violence in the workplace policy and have procedures and planning guidelines in place so they can increase safety. And this all should be done with victim participation in mind and victim well-being and safety in mind. Non-judgmental, supportive assistance with accessing resources is what many victims report they need the most. tied with workplace accommodations, like altered work schedules, work locations, allowing for PTO for court dates, and other things like that that keep their safety in mind. Workplaces, at the end of the day, really can be a big part in ending intimate partner violence by creating safe and supportive environments. Here are some important resources. So the first one I have listed is our website, the TN Coalition. There's a prevention tab at the very top, and you can see all of our violence prevention initiatives, including some information about this. We're also working on a prevention website. It's going to be preventtn.org. That's coming very soon. So you'll be able to find information there. You can also contact me directly. My contact information is going to be on the last slide. I'm going to leave it up while we do Q&A. We have like a self-guided e-learning on this information. If you want to have your leadership staff take it, it's new. We're working on it, so we want your feedback. So if you're willing to take that, there is some incentives. There's like a $20 incentive for taking it and $20 for completing a follow-up survey. So there's some financial incentives for helping us perfect or improve this training that we're doing, as well as anyone who is supervised by a supervisor who takes the training also gets kind of like a workplace temperature check survey that they also get a $20 incentive for doing. So if you're interested in further training on this for your workplace and your supervisors, please reach out to me, because we're hoping to get this into as many hands as possible. For assistance for victim supports, including safety planning or local and state resources, you can start with the national hotline, and I put their information here. And that's just good for anyone to have and be able to give to victims. Additionally, if you have any questions or want to know more about different kinds of best practices and different kind of policy recommendations, this website, Workplaces Respond, is doing so much work in helping organizations create policies. So that's kind of what they do. And then this is my contact information. So please use my email. You can call me. I'm really interested in trying to get this training out into the world and into as many ears and eyes and hands and hearts as possible. So at this point, please write down my stuff, take a screenshot, whatever you need to do, and let me know if there are any questions. I'm going to look at some of the comments that have come through. Yeah, when HR gets involved, they take over the situation. They can, which is one of the reasons why we're hoping to train HR staff, specifically HR and leadership staff, on some of this stuff, so that they can be aware of what we might call trauma-informed workplace, trauma-informed workplace policies and procedures that take into account victim safety, not just organizational safety, but also victim safety. Yes, some companies have separate policy on leave or PTO specifically for the reasons of domestic violence. Any organization that has that is ahead of the curve. Like, they are doing great. I wish that everyone had that or would do that. But in Tennessee, victims are not, most workers are not in protected classes, and victims are definitely not. So there's no unfortunately, there's no legal incentive for businesses to do that, but I think that they should. So we can talk to people about doing things like this, and also be advocating for greater legal protections at the same time. Is what I think we should be doing. Is, we can advocate for different companies and agencies to be doing this regardless of the legal of waiting for the law to catch up, and we can be getting the law to catch up at the same time. In my opinion, that's my soapbox, maybe. What should workplaces do when there is a threat of danger to others in the workplace besides the victim? Like the abuser is threatening to hurt everyone. Also, if other employees express fear or danger regarding the coworker's DV situation. That's a great question. So this is where your organization can get an order of protection against that abuser. This is where you can be making safety plans, you know, company-wide safety plans. Like, these are things that we're doing to keep everyone safe, and they can be really general, right, without having to break the confidentiality of the person, you know, necessarily. Probably maybe everyone might know kind of unofficially, but you should still probably try to protect that person's confidentiality. So you don't necessarily need to out, like, because George is outside, you know, we're going to do this thing, but just to say, you know, with everyone's safety in mind, we're going to take these different precautions at this time. That's how I think that I would recommend handling that situation. Maybe having people on hand who can talk to individuals who are specifically afraid and maybe want their own specific plans as well. But really just keeping everyone's safety in mind, getting that order of protection against that person if you can as an organization. Those kind of things could really help. Thanks, Crystal. It's good to see you here too. Crystal and I used to work together. It's great to see her in this training. I think that Colorado is in the process of passing a law to mandate time off. That's so good. That's like what I think it can be called protected time, where the employer is not even allowed to ask like what you need the time for, and you can use it for court or orders of protection or those things that you need. That's wonderful. That is like, we all need to write our Congress people immediately and ask for these kind of things to happen. Good job, Colorado. A+. Thanks, Deborah. Appreciate you. Thanks, Linda. How can an employer best respond when a victim's performance is suffering due to the abuse or being disrupted by calls from the abuser? Yes, to the extent that they are in danger of being fired. Yes, this is great. So I think that this is the situation that we find ourselves in as supervisors, right? If the work performance is suffering, it puts us in a situation, right, where we're having to do our duty as supervisors of making sure that work is done, and we need to find ways to be empathetic and supportive. So I think that starting from a place of curiosity is always where I would want to start, of like, hey, I've noticed that there's this is happening. I've noticed that you get multiple calls. I've noticed that you seem stressed. And I would just notice, like, you're just naming facts at that point, right? You're not like, there's no judgments there. You're just noticing and stating facts. I'm noticing that these things are happening. Can you talk to me about that? Can you tell me about what's going on? You know, what do you need? Another thing of what do you need? What do you want? You know, is really good to say to people, because people often know, they know that they're stressed. They know that their work performance is not as great as they want it to be. You're probably not going to tell them anything that they don't know. So inviting them into the conversation of, what do you think the solution is? What do you think would help you be safer? What do you think could help you be, you know, more productive at work and safer at work? Ideas on that, you know, and that's something that you can include them in the conversation for. When it continues to be an issue, you have to start to get a little bit more strong on that, I think, and say, we really need this performance to be different. We really need something to change. What can that look like? You can't make a person, you know, leave an abusive relationship, unfortunately, but you can hopefully help them be safe enough to do their work while they're at work. So that's kind of what I would say with that. Yeah, we don't want to move towards firing someone just because someone else is calling a whole bunch, right? But if productivity is suffering, productivity is suffering. And that can be supported in a compassionate and kind way towards a growth mindset instead of like a punishment mindset, I think would be the way that I would try to encourage that to change, with compassion and, you know, kindness as much as we could. Are there other questions, comments, thoughts? Well, I appreciate you guys for being engaged and attending and caring about this very important issue. Please let me know if you would like further training, or if your organization would like further training. We are here to assist and help in any way that we can. I will give you guys 5 minutes of your time back, and I hope that you were able to like go get a cup of tea or something refreshing for yourselves. Thanks, everyone.